Margaret Wilson walked into the terminal wearing a well-worn navy tracksuit and a faded sweatshirt, her travel bag slung over one shoulder and her silver wedding bracelet loosely wrapped around her wrist. She looked like any other elderly passenger that day, gentle, composed, quiet. What no one noticed, though, was that Margaret was the mother of Brandon Wilson, the CEO and sole owner of SkyNova Airlines, one of the most prestigious aviation companies in the country. She had always preferred a life of simplicity, away from the spotlight her son constantly occupied, and today was no different. She was flying to Boston to visit the city where she had once built a life with her late husband, cherishing quiet memories rather than grandeur. As the boarding call for first-class passengers echoed through the terminal, Margaret stepped forward, presenting her ticket with calm assurance. Her boarding pass clearly showed Seat 2A, one of the most coveted spots on the aircraft. She walked past the curious stares of travelers dressed in tailored suits and luxury scarves, her presence seemingly out of place among the elegance and polish of the first-class crowd. Still, she carried herself with quiet dignity, finding her seat and settling by the window with a small book in hand, unaware that this routine flight would soon turn into a moment of painful public humiliation that would echo far beyond the confines of the plane. Not long after she sat down, a white flight attendant named Heather glanced over and immediately frowned. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she leaned toward her colleague Mark and whispered, "Do you think she's supposed to be here?" Mark, tall and well-groomed, with an air of practiced politeness, turned to look. His friendly facade dropped for a moment as he eyed Margaret. "Let's check her boarding pass," he said under his breath. The two attendants, now clearly uncomfortable, hovered near Margaret's seat, murmuring and casting glances, unaware that other passengers were beginning to take notice of their behavior. Their voices were low, but their intentions clear. Margaret didn't look like she belonged in that seat. Moments later, Mark stepped forward, his tone soft but heavy with condescension. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "May I verify your boarding pass again? Just a small check due to a system update." Margaret looked up, her eyes, kind but firm, and handed him her phone. "Of course," she said, showing her clearly marked first-class seat. Mark took a moment longer than necessary, squinting at the screen, then offered a hesitant smile before stepping back. But instead of ending the matter, there he returned moments later with Heather and a third attendant, Ashley. The three formed a small wall near Margaret's seat, whispering and nodding toward her as if confirming some unspoken suspicion. Then came the final blow. Heather returned, this time accompanied by the head of cabin service, Caroline, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze. Caroline's tone was controlled, but icy as she approached Margaret. "Ma'am," she said, "this section is reserved for premium passengers. You may have boarded the wrong section. Could we see your identification, please?" The words stung, not just because of their implication, but because of the audience they were delivered in front of, passengers who now watched silently, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, but none with the courage to speak up. Margaret calmly explained she had already shown her valid boarding pass, but Caroline insisted using vague references to airline policy and security standards to justify the demand. As Margaret sat frozen holding her phone, and her pride in equal measure, the message was clear. Her appearance, her race, her simplicity, none of it fit their image of someone who deserved to be there. And so, despite having followed every rule, despite purchasing her ticket fair and square, Margaret was eventually asked to leave her seat so further verification could be conducted. The humiliation was not shouted, nor was it violent. It was subtle, polite, and devastating. As she gathered her things, the silence of the cabin spoke louder than any insult, the quiet approval of injustice wrapped in manners and protocol. That flight was supposed to be a quiet return to memory for Margaret. Instead, it became a painful reminder of how deeply embedded bias still runs. No one knew who she was. No one cared that she was the mother of the man who built the very airline they worked for. They saw only her skin, her clothes, and their own assumptions. And in doing so, They exposed a rot hidden beneath the luxury, a belief that certain people don't belong in certain places, not because of any rule, but because of who they are and how they look. It would take one phone call, one name, and one truth to shake their world. But in that moment for Margaret, it was just another quiet injustice, one she had faced too many times before. As the plane touched down in Boston and the seatbelt signs dimmed, Margaret Wilson calmly gathered her belongings, her outward composure masking the sting of what she had just endured. The humiliation lingered like a fog around her, quiet, invisible, but suffocating. She exited the plane without a word, her simple attire now feeling heavier than ever, a cloak of quiet dignity wrapped around her aching heart. While the other passengers filed out into the terminal with eager anticipation of their destinations, Margaret pulled out her phone. The screen was lit with missed calls and unread messages, most of them from one person: her son, Brandon Wilson. Brandon, the CEO and founder of SkyNova Airlines, had already been alerted. A junior employee at Logan Airport had overheard the incident over the internal radio and recognized the name on the manifest. Within minutes, Brandon knew he had spent years building SkyNova from a regional carrier into a global brand priding himself on values of fairness, innovation, and customer-first service. And now his own mother had been treated like a criminal in first class by people wearing the logo he built with his own hands. When Margaret called, his voice was already trembling, not with uncertainty, but with fury barely restrained. "Mom," he said, breathless, "tell me everything." Margaret spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully, as she always did. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The truth alone was enough. When she finished, Brandon went silent for a long moment. Then his voice dropped into a cold, decisive tone she had heard only once, before the day he had fired an entire regional management team for mistreating disabled passengers. "Thank you," he said softly. "This won't go unanswered." The next morning, before sunrise, Brandon arrived at SkyNova's headquarters. An emergency meeting was scheduled, attendance mandatory for all senior management, cabin leadership, and corporate communications. At the center of that long mahogany conference table sat three names highlighted in red: Heather, Mark, and Ashley. The three attendants walked into the boardroom with polite smiles, blissfully unaware of what awaited them. To them, this was just another debrief, a routine corporate review, maybe even a commendation for maintaining order during a suspicious boarding. They sat confidently exchanging pleasantries with colleagues, sipping coffee as though their actions had been heroic. But when Brandon entered the room, the atmosphere changed instantly. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't smile. He simply walked to the head of the table, placed a slim folder down, and looked out across the room with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. What happened on Flight 486 from Denver to Boston, he began, was not a misunderstanding. It was not a security measure. It was not protocol. He paused, letting the silence settle. It was prejudice, dressed up as procedure, justified by uniforms, enabled by silence. The room froze. Heather's smile faltered. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ashley's fingers tightened around her cup. Brandon's voice grew firmer. "The woman you humiliated yesterday, Margaret Wilson, is my mother." Gasps echoed through the room, the color drained from the faces of the three attendants, and for the first time they understood that their actions had not been invisible. They had struck at the heart of the very company they claimed to represent. Brandon didn't stop there. He turned the folder toward the room, revealing a printed transcript of internal flight communications, a photo of Margaret's boarding pass, and a summary of witness statements from passengers. "This company was built to serve everyone with dignity," he continued, "but what you revealed yesterday is a rot beneath our surface, a disease we've allowed to grow because we've trained you to smile at wealth, not people, to enforce comfort, not fairness. And now, because of your choices, the world will know exactly who we are or who we claim to be." The silence that followed wasn't just stunned, it was shameful. Eyes dropped, breaths held. Every person in that room realized that this wasn't a public relations crisis, It was a moral reckoning. I'm not here to protect reputations, Brandon said. Finally, his voice quieter but heavier. I'm here to protect the soul of this company, and the soul is sick, but it's not too late to heal. With those words, he announced a sweeping reform initiative that would begin immediately: mandatory anti-bias training, systemic changes to hiring and evaluation procedures, and a public apology delivered by the leadership team itself. SkyNova will not be remembered for what happened yesterday, he said. It will be remembered for what we do next. As he stood ending the meeting, the weight of his words hung over the room like judgment and like a chance for redemption. The morning after Brandon's searing address to his executive team, the conference room at SkyNova's headquarters was filled once again, but this time the tension was heavier, quieter, like the hush before a storm of truth. Managers from every division were present: legal, HR, cabin operations, public affairs. At the center of the room sat a reserved chair unoccupied until the moment the doors quietly opened and Margaret Wilson stepped in. She wore the same navy tracksuit from the flight. Her expression was calm, her walk steady, but her presence carried weight far more than the CEO's mother. She was now the voice of every passenger who had been silently judged, doubted, or dismissed. Brandon stood beside her as she entered, but didn't speak. This was her moment. Margaret walked to the head of the table and without notes or a prepared speech began with a voice so steady it silenced the room. I'm not here to accuse anyone, she said. I'm not here to demand apologies or revenge. I'm here to make sure what happened to me never happens again, to me or to anyone else. She paused briefly, letting the gravity of that intention land, then gently placed a small file folder on the table. Inside, these are the stories of 27 passengers over the last 3 months who were questioned, delayed, or asked to vacate their seats despite having valid tickets. 23 of them were black or people of color. Gasps and nervous shifting rippled through the boardroom. The air thickened as Margaret opened the folder and pulled out several printed documents: flight reports, complaint records, anonymous surveys. You've called them system glitches, miscommunications, isolated mistakes. She continued, her voice calm but firm. But I see a pattern that speaks louder than any PR statement or employee handbook. You don't need more training in protocol. You need training in empathy. You need to look at who's being questioned and who's being trusted without even realizing why her words were soft-spoken, but they carried more force than any shouting ever could. Because what she was delivering wasn't an attack. It was a mirror. Several board members looked visibly shaken. One attempted to respond, but Margaret raised her hand not to silence, but to guide. Please let me finish, she said. The issue isn't Heather, Mark, or Ashley. It's not just about those who executed the harm. It's about the culture that quietly allowed it. The unspoken message that says certain people are suspicious based on how they look, what they wear, or what seat they sit in. She took a deep breath, scanning the faces of those in the room, some defensive, some thoughtful, others humbled by discomfort. This isn't just a training problem, it's a systems problem, and systems don't change until we admit they're broken. Margaret then spoke of dignity, not as a policy term, but as a lived experience. When I sat in that seat, I wasn't just a passenger. I was a test. A test. Your crew failed, not because they're bad people, but because the system they work in hasn't taught them better, hasn't required them to look beyond stereotypes, hasn't expected them to question their own assumptions. She leaned slightly forward. I'm not asking for a speech or a gesture. I'm asking for a shift in mindset in hiring, in how you measure what excellence looks like. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was reverent. Everyone in the room could feel that something irreversible was happening. By the time Margaret finished, she didn't stand triumphant. She stood still as if waiting not for applause, but for understanding. You have a choice now, she said softly. To double down on the way things have always been done, or to create something better. Not just for me, not just for your reputation, but for every future passenger who boards your plane with the simple hope of being treated like a human being. She gently closed the file, looked around once more, then nodded to Brandon. He stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. No words were needed. Her message had already changed the room. Now the question was whether it would change the company. In the days following Margaret's testimony, the atmosphere at SkyNova headquarters remained heavy but focused. The executive board had unanimously approved Brandon's reform agenda, and changes were already underway. But when it came to the three flight attendants, Heather Ashley and Mark Brandon faced a difficult decision. The public expected termination. The press whispered about accountability. But Brandon, in a closed-door meeting with his mother, said something that surprised even himself. Firing them won't change anything if they walk away without understanding what they did. Margaret looked at him and simply nodded. And so Brandon made his choice not out of leniency, but out of conviction. Instead of firing them, Brandon reassigned all three to work full-time in economy class for 3 months. No special privileges, no executive protections, just hands-on service with passengers from all walks of life. The goal wasn't punishment. It was perspective. Mark, who had once measured passengers by their clothes and demeanor, now spent 12-hour shifts pushing meal carts down narrow aisles, helping elderly passengers with overhead luggage, and answering questions from exhausted travelers, juggling children and carry-ons. At first, the transition was humiliating, but slowly discomfort gave way to insight. With each passing day, Mark's lens began to shift. He started listening more, judging less. One quiet afternoon during a flight from Atlanta to Seattle, Mark glanced down the aisle and froze. There, seated in 14A near the wing, was Margaret Wilson. Dressed as simply as ever, she sat quietly by the window. Her eyes turned toward the clouds outside. Mark's chest tightened. He hadn't seen her since the board meeting. A dozen thoughts ran through his mind. Guilt, shame, uncertainty, but finally courage overcame hesitation. As the drink service wrapped, he approached her row, slowly stopping beside her seat. "Mrs. Wilson," he said gently. Margaret turned, meeting his eyes with a calmness that made him feel even smaller. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. She nodded silently. Mark crouched slightly so he wouldn't tower over her, his voice quieter than usual. "I've wanted to talk to you for a long time." He began, his hands loosely folded. "I can't undo what I did, and I don't expect forgiveness just because I feel bad. But these past few months, working in economy, seeing people differently, it's changed something in me." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I didn't realize how automatic my assumptions had become. The way I looked at people, the way I evaluated worth, without even knowing I was doing it. What happened to you wasn't just wrong. It revealed something in me I needed to see." His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. Margaret listened without interrupting. She could feel the sincerity in his words, not rehearsed, not defensive. She let him continue. "The first time I helped an elderly Latino man in the back row with his suitcase, Mark said he looked at me with so much gratitude for something so simple, and I realized I'd never thought about how I made people feel before, just how efficiently I could get through the service list." He took a breath. "I know now that respect isn't earned through status or clothing. It's something everyone deserves from the start. I'm ashamed that I didn't see it sooner, and I'm truly sorry for the harm I caused you." The cabin hummed faintly in the background, but the moment between them was still. Margaret placed her book aside and looked at him with soft but steady eyes. "Mark," she said, "what you just said. That is the beginning of real change. Not because you apologized to me, but because you've started to understand yourself." Her voice was gentle, but full of conviction. "We can't change what we refuse to admit, and you've admitted something many never do." She paused, then added, "It takes more strength to face our inner biases than to pretend they don't exist. You've done that. Now your job is to carry that lesson forward, not just in your work, but in how you treat every person from this day on." Her hand rested briefly on his arm, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Mark nodded, his eyes glassy but clear. "Thank you," he whispered. "I promise you I won't waste what I've learned." As he stood to return to his duties, he glanced back once more, not to seek validation, but to carry the memory of this moment with him. And Margaret, turning back to the window, felt something shift within herself too. This wasn't just an apology, it was transformation in motion, a quiet testament to what happens when someone is willing to confront the truth, humble themselves, and commit to something better. The sky outside looked the same as it always had, but inside something profound had changed. In the months that followed, Margaret Wilson's quiet stand. SkyNova Airlines transformed in ways few could have anticipated. What began as a single painful incident evolved into a company-wide reckoning that touched every level of the organization. Brandon Wilson, true to his word, led the charge personally. SkyNova launched a sweeping anti-bias initiative, mandatory for all staff from executives in glass-walled offices to ground crew on the tarmac. But it didn't stop at training sessions and check-the-box compliance. The Human Resources Department rewrote its entire performance evaluation framework, integrating diversity, inclusion, and empathy metrics into how employees were promoted, recognized, or redirected. It was no longer enough to be efficient, one had to be equitable. Weekly listening circles were implemented across SkyNova's hubs, giving employees a space to share experiences and challenge assumptions. Anonymous feedback forms were placed in every crew lounge and corporate floor. External equity consultants, many of whom were activists or academics with lived experience, were brought in to hold quarterly reviews. Brandon made one thing clear at every town hall: the company's reputation would no longer rest on its luxury service or international reach, but on its commitment to treating every passenger, every employee with dignity. The message was echoed in new hiring practices, revised onboarding protocols, and public statements across SkyNova's platforms. What had once been a scandal had become the starting line for reinvention, but the ripple effect extended beyond SkyNova. As news of the board meeting, the data Margaret presented, and the reforms that followed began circulating through the media, the public took notice, talk shows covered it, news outlets praised it, civil rights organizations amplified it, and most notably, airlines across the country began re-examining their own records and operations. What resulted was unprecedented. An industry-wide summit was held in Washington, D.C., bringing together the major carriers of the US, Canada, the UK, and several leading international airlines. From that summit emerged a historic declaration, the Aviation Alliance for Equity, a joint commitment signed by over 30 airlines, pledging transparency, anti-discrimination training, and proactive diversity audits across their fleets. Margaret's story was highlighted in the Alliance's founding address. Her photo, seated calmly on the SkyNova flight in her Navy tracksuit, appeared in publications across the world. She became a symbol not of protest, but of transformation. Quiet strength, clear truth, and the refusal to let injustice go unanswered. Yet through all the attention and accolades, Margaret remained the same. She continued living simply away from the spotlight, speaking only when needed and always with grace. For her, it was never about attention. It was about making sure no one else had to carry the weight of silent humiliation at 30,000 feet. Months later, Margaret found herself once again aboard a SkyNova Airlines flight, this time en route to San Francisco for a speaking engagement. She boarded without hesitation, still dressed in the same kind of modest clothing she always wore, but something was different. As she entered the first-class cabin, she noticed a quiet energy. The smiles were warmer, the greetings more thoughtful. Across the aisle sat a young Asian couple sharing a book. 2 rows up, a black teenager in a band hoodie was reading music sheets, and beside her in seat 2C, an older Hispanic woman rested comfortably with headphones on. It was the most diverse group of first-class passengers Margaret had ever seen, and not a single crew member blinked at it. Then, as the crew moved through the aisle checking overhead bins, Margaret noticed a familiar face. Mark. The same flight attendant who once questioned her legitimacy was helping an elderly black man secure his walking cane. His tone was gentle, his eyes respectful, and when he caught Margaret's glance from across the cabin, he gave a subtle nod, filled with something deeper than words: gratitude, reverence, and proof of change. Margaret returned the nod and turned to the window, a soft smile on her lips. The plane hadn't even taken off, but she could already feel it. A new chapter had begun, not just for SkyNova, not just for aviation, but for everyone who had ever waited quietly for the world to catch up to their worth. The gentle hum of the aircraft faded into the background as Margaret leaned back in her seat. Eyes closed, the quiet thrum of altitude settling in her chest, but her thoughts weren't in the clouds, they were anchored in memory. She recalled that day she was asked to leave her seat, the sting of invisible judgment, the silence of fellow passengers who turned away. She remembered Brandon's face when she told him, the way his voice lowered with quiet rage and love. But most of all, she remembered standing in that boardroom, file in hand, voice steady, and realizing that the moment wasn't about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had been asked to prove they deserved the space they'd already earned. Back then, she never imagined that her voice would trigger a wave of transformation, yet now she could see it everywhere, not just in SkyNova's new policies or the industry-wide reform initiatives, but in the everyday interactions, the genuine way flight attendants now looked passengers in the eye, the diversity reflected in staff recruitment videos. The fact that passengers like her no longer needed to brace for skepticism when boarding first class, but it wasn't just aviation that had shifted. Human resources directors from tech companies, retailers, and even city governments had reached out to Brandon and his team, asking to learn from their model. Margaret's story had become a case study in empathy-driven reform, proof that real change begins not with force, but with truth. 6 months after the first reforms went live, SkyNova held an internal ceremony to mark the completion of their inaugural Equity and Inclusion Initiative. Brandon stood at the front of the stage, flanked by department leaders, journalists, and community partners, and beside him, by quiet insistence, stood Margaret. She didn't want applause. She didn't want recognition. She just wanted to look the new recruits in the eye and remind them, the uniform you wear doesn't make you better than others. It gives you the responsibility to treat others better than they've often been treated. Her words weren't grand, they were personal, but they struck deeper than any prepared corporate speech ever could. After the ceremony, a young attendant approached her with tears in her eyes. She was Latina in her 20s and had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother about being overlooked and disrespected while traveling. "I just want you to know," she whispered, "because of you, I walk into this job feeling like I belong, and I promise to protect that feeling for others." Margaret smiled gently and touched the young woman's hand. That was the moment she understood fully. Her story hadn't just corrected an injustice, it had become a bridge, a connection between generations, a light forward for people who had always been told to stay quiet, stay small, stay out of sight. Later that year, the Aviation Alliance for Equity published its first accountability report, citing major progress across member airlines, fewer passenger complaints related to discrimination, broader representation in management, and higher employee satisfaction scores among minority groups. But tucked into the opening pages was a short dedication. It read, "To Margaret Wilson, whose quiet courage reminded us that equity is not a policy, it's a daily choice. And dignity is not a reward, it is a right." Brandon framed a copy of that page and placed it in the SkyNova executive wing beneath a single quote from his mother. "We change the world not by yelling louder, but by standing longer than the silence." And so Margaret's legacy was etched not in headlines or plaques, but in every act of awareness, every policy rewritten, and every passenger who now stepped into a cabin without fear of being treated as less. Her journey, once marked by pain, had become a compass for fairness. And even though she returned to her quiet life, away from the spotlight, she knew this much. The world she left behind in that boardroom was no longer the same. It was a little more awake, a little more human. And from 30,000 feet in the sky, she could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that the future was flying in the right direction. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on what dignity and fairness truly mean in our everyday lives. At Deep Inside HQ, we're committed to telling powerful human-centered stories that challenge prejudice, awaken empathy, and inspire real change. If you believe in building a world where every voice matters and every person is treated with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like, subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it and join us in spreading truth, compassion, and courage, one story at a time.